Great. Thank you very much. I'm also very happy to be here and to share this with you. I'm going to be switching between two computers. So hopefully that won't cause too much trouble. I am an associate professor of architecture at KTH in Stockholm, and Stockholm is in Sweden, and if you're not very familiar where that is, I just wanted to show you the European map, and Sweden is this long country up here. So I'm based in Stockholm. And what I wanted to talk to you today about is the kind of a long history of Swedish housing question, and I will give the very short version of that. So it's an overview. It will go very quickly, and I hope you can bear with me, and maybe in the discussion we can return to some of the issues that I've brought up. And so this is ongoing. This is a mix of ongoing practice and research. And the story that I want to tell you is the story how Sweden moved very quickly from a country of farmers to a country of a welfare state, and then into a globalized society. And this was a movement, of course, brought on by the late industrialization of the Swedish society. So at the turn of the last century, between 18 and 1900s, is when the move to the cities occurred in Sweden. And you can see that the rural population declined and the urban population declined. And this is very common in Europe. The difference in Sweden was that this was fairly late, so we could learn from other countries. And very early on, we could start shaping the city based on these new ideals that we could call the functionalist or the modernist ideals. And you can even see it in Gunnar Asplund's library, the public library in Stockholm, is that this is when architects are turning from designing monuments and castles to designing public spaces and public institutions. So this is the instance of the public library being given to the public of Stockholm, along with the large urban space, the park, alongside of it. And Sweden was very early in seeing the political force of the built environment. So at the beginning of the 1900s, Sweden had the lowest living standard or housing standard in Europe. And in a concerted political effort, moved this position from the bottom to the top. And one of the key documents is what's called the Housing Social Report, which was a government report that was done over a 12-year period, where all the empirical data was collected, all of the understanding of the financial system, all of the understanding of the education of architects and planners and construction industry was documented and then put into play. This type of empirical data was collected. This is when the researchers would go into the homes of people who were overcrowded, living in the inner city, and documenting how many chairs, how many beds, how many tables. They interviewed them, how many books do they have, what do they do during the day, what's their income, how big are the rooms in terms of square meters. And then that was the ground for pushing the housing question through policy into the housing market. And so there were a number of housing fairs arranged. This one is from 1945. To move the knowledge from the research and the industry to the population. So this was as much a construction of the consumer as it was a construction of the housing. This magazine is the magazine of the Craft Association that were also behind the studies documenting what is the needs for a modern child in this new society. They need space to play, they need light, they need beds. And so the bedrooms could then be designed to accommodate these functions. And Sweden was also a forerunner in the satellite cities. So instead of just building sleeping areas, they built what was called in Sweden the ABC city. This is Vällingby from 1956. And the ABC city stood for A for arbete, which means work, B for bostäder, which means housing, and C for center or commercial and cultural facilities. So the ABC city is here documented and usually manifest as a built environment, but I think this image is more interesting almost looking at the people, how most of these people were probably born on a farm and very quickly moved into the cities and accommodated a new lifestyle. But at the same time, I'm also now finding documentation that the construction industry, usually completely male situations, was consolidating its efforts. So these are images from a group that call themselves the D4 group, that are actually the forerunners of the 4 large construction companies that now dominate the Swedish market. So already in the mid-century, these guys are plotting on how to take over our cities. But on the good side, this knowledge was collected in the writing called God Bostad, Good Housing, and this is a short document that everyone could read and understand. And so it was policy and implemented, and this was the minimum level that architects and construction industry had to reach to get favorable government loans. And it went so far that the government promised in 1967 to deliver to the whole population healthy, spacious, well-planned, and purposefully equipped dwellings of high quality at a fair price. And anyone who has worked with housing knows that this is a very difficult promise. But in Sweden, it was promised and delivered. There were a number of new companies and organizations that were created during this period. And one of the most interesting was HSB, which was a public-private housing owner that put out this writing called a social crane. So the crane was the symbolic of lifting someone out of social misery into a better life situation. And of course, the crane also had the double meaning of the industrial production, because it was through standardization and the industrial production methods, and you know them today as IKEA, that Sweden was able to produce such a high number of high-quality housing units. And so this is a kitchen study, for example, where a flashlight was put onto a woman and she cooked fish au gratin with tomatoes and rose hip soup. And it says you can clearly see the connection between the workbench and stove. But almost the most interesting thing here also is looking behind the woman and seeing the cabinets. And just to make sure that there was enough stores to deliver the right-sized packages that would fit into the cabinets was as big a project as actually putting the kitchens into the homes of all of the new urban dwellers. And so Sweden delivered what was called well-planned and of high standard. Well-planned is the functionalist ethic, and high standard meant functioning bathrooms and kitchens with hot and cold water. And it was done through industrialization. So we actually pushed the industrialization process in Europe very far. And this is a short list of words that when we today say industrialized building, we usually mean prefabricated. But during the 60s and 70s, it meant all of these things. And there was a much more nuanced discussion of where one wanted to push the housing production. Flexible, dynamic, elastic, for example, is that you can change the walls within the apartment. That's flexible. Dynamic is that you can change function over time. Elastic is that you can change the size of the apartment over time. And so these are words that have fallen into, we've forgotten them. But of course, there was a very fast backlash also of the post-war project. So this is one of the areas called Tensta outside of Stockholm, and you can, if you look carefully, you can see all of the building cranes on the horizon, and this led to an immediate critique of the housing being too uniform, too similar, and too much concrete, and too boring. And this critique was based on the fact that the citizens that moved into the residence were seen as victims of bad planning and bad design. If we push 40 years ahead to the current situation, it's interesting that now the citizens living in these areas are seen as the cause, not the victims, but the cause of the areas being bad. Think socioeconomic weak multicultural areas. And it also found its way into popular media, for example, into this movie. So I will try to show a clip. So this was a movie from 1973, where a social worker was so disgruntled with the areas that were being produced that he saw the kids being the victims of bad planning, that he, the social worker sitting in the car, met this youth gang, and he actually instigates the youth gang to murder the city architect. And so this is an extremely dystopic movie, but it has all of the elements of the critique of modernism in a very early phase. So here the social worker is confronting the youth gang for the first time after they almost destroyed his car. And in the background here you can see this housing area called Skärholmen, southwest of Stockholm. And so the short summary of this history is that in 1915 we had very few people living in the urban areas, only 25% about. And then in 1930 the introduction of the functionalist style called funkis in Sweden. And by 1945 we were in the middle of the political project called the People's Home, Folkhemmet. And by the 60s we were into the last push of modernization called the record years, and by the end of 1975 we had solved the housing question, but society had completely shifted. And just for comparison, in 2015 now we have about 85% of Swedes living in urban areas, and of a total housing stock of 4.5 million, about 40,000 units are produced a year, so that's only 1% that's added. And here you can see the diagram from 1945 to 2009, where the graph shows the total number of housing units produced in thousands. So you have over 100,000 during the peak, which is from 1965 to 1974, which is called the Million Program era. And the blue line is multifamily homes, and the red line is single-family homes. So you can see that the growth in production is in multifamily housing. And the growth is in quantity and quality over a 30-year period of time after all the empiric data was collected in the 30s and 40s. And then it was sharply dropped from 80,000 in multifamily homes to less than 20,000 in 2 or 3 years. And this is the first wave of globalization. It's the OPEC oil crisis of '73 and the student revolts in Paris in 1968 and the slowdown of urbanization. And then you can see a short peak in the late 80s, which coincides with the housing bubble in Sweden and the restructuring of the banking system, which in architecture was also the postmodern phase. In the postmodern phase, you would have, for example, this type of project built in Stockholm. The building to the right is by Ricardo Bofill, and it's an interesting thing because it was actually the construction industry that was left over from the Million Program era that enabled this new housing to be produced. And it was only a shift of shape or form. So now instead of being straight, they were rounded, and instead of being without ornament, they were now with ornament. But it was still the same industry. And this is a typical apartment from that period. And we also, since the housing production slowed down because of the boom, we turned into renovation and reconstruction of the modernistic areas. So this is an example where a soccer field was built in the middle of the park as a way of trying to regenerate these areas. This is also where I did some work as a practicing architect, restructuring apartments and changing them into new configurations. For example, this is 2 apartments that have been put together to a 166 square meter flat to accommodate a new family in Sweden. This is a Somali-Swedish family with husband and wife and 10 kids. And to put this in perspective, they previously lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, and so we were back to the last turn of the century overcrowding situation with large families living in small apartments. But given this, the post-war housing was actually very good for accommodating this new global society. And then, as we move on in the quick history, there's been a number of attempts of trying to turn these modernistic areas into walkable cities, and all of them have failed. And we also have this huge movement in the early 2000s and up until 2010 of building new areas on the former harbor areas in the major cities. This is from Gothenburg in Malmö in Sweden, I'm sorry, in Västra Hamnen. And we also look now at what is being built, and we can see that there's a return to the block city. And the block city contains houses that are very thick to meet environmental demands. Round houses, essentially, or squared round houses, have shorter exterior walls, which means that they consume less energy in the Nordic country, where heating is very expensive. And therefore, we make the buildings, instead of 12 meters thick, we make them 22 meters thick. And this also gives a very large zone in the center, which is a dark zone, which also becomes very profitable for the real estate market to sell. So we actually make smaller apartments per room, but larger in terms of associated spaces. We can also see, if we look on a regional scale, that the red dots is where owner apartments are being built, and on the gray dots are where rental apartments are being built. We're actually, through the construction of the city, we are segregating the city right now. And Malmö, Gothenburg, and Stockholm have all given similar reports showing that the average lifespan, if you grow up in a rich area or a poor area, can differ as much as 8 years. So if you grow up in a poor area, you have a little bit harder time to get through school, you have a little bit harder time to get a good job, you get a job that's a little bit more physically difficult, you get sick earlier, and you die earlier. And I will return to this diagram in just a moment, but I can show this effect over time also as a final image. We see now that the global sustainability goals are, of course, also pushing into design, and but mostly on the surface of ideology. When you look at what's actually being built, it's very This is an area that was developed. All of the houses behind the high-rises were built first and sold with a view to the sea, and then the high-rises were built in front of them. And so this is one of the most segregated areas built in Stockholm right now. And we can, of course, see the rise of the real estate market and big data. We can see now that because everyone has access to incredible amounts of information in their phones, they are also choosing to live with people who are very similar to themselves in very similar apartments. So the physical extension of the digital world is becoming very much uniformity, whereas the desire is to get away from the uniformity of the post-war period, which is a strange contradiction. And we see a number of alliances and companies now, like this one, which is called Everybody, which is a very exclusive co-live work association. And this one, which is selling the idea of living in an urban condition with smaller space, which gives you a bigger life. And I question that because the large influx of immigrants that we had in the fall of 2015 right now are living in this type of condition. So the smaller space is not leading to bigger life for most people. And in the Swedish context, we've had a long history of making more space in order to have a richer life. So now I will show this diagram as a final, and then I will show one animation. And this is the curve over a 150-year period. Oops. And you don't see the curve now, but we'll return to that, hopefully. Yeah, this one first, yeah. I'm sorry I'm taking too much time now. I just wanted to give you, this is from 1915 all the way to 2065. And you can see the post-war buildup here again, and the Million Program, which is the modernist, high modernist period. And then you have a period of deregulation from 1975 to 1995 with a boom and a large urban sprawl, single-family homes built. Then you have the market-driven period from 2000 to 2015, where politicians said the market can solve the housing question, and nothing happened. And then suddenly we have a large influx of immigration, and we have a desire to build lots of housing. And so this is where we see a trajectory that either we will renovate the existing housing badly and build new bad housing and need to renovate very quickly, or even the housing question will disappear completely because the new urban agenda is to live and work in a similar place, not to build housing. Now we can shift. Now I'll show you the final. So we're in a very precarious position where we can either build a new society of which we know very little what it should be, or we can build a continued segregated city. And this is one type of statistical data that we use. This is a diagram that I will play. This is showing all of the small neighborhoods in the region of Stockholm over a period of time, showing their income on the lower scale, and on the vertical scale showing their education rate. And what we have here is that we see that all of Stockholm is moving in the right direction. So all of Stockholm is getting a higher income and higher education during the period of 2000 to 2014. But we see the difference between the poor areas and the rich areas increasing. So the rich areas are moving away and the poor areas are staying put. So if we shift the same diagram and instead show numbers of people moving in. So right now, numbers of people moving into the area and numbers of people moving out of the areas, and related to income. And you can see that the rich areas have a fairly stable population. The poor areas are losing population. So what that means is that the poor areas people move into, get a job, and move out. But this also means that these segregated areas are even more difficult to uphold schooling, to uphold education, and welfare issues. So this is a physical response of the late New Public Management Society. Thank you.